Okay, this is quotes, and these are from the Holy Grail of Wisdom quotes by me, Pete Rogers. And the first person we're going to talk about is Kenneth Burke. Now, this is a different Burke. This is a guy who was a famous American rhetorician. And where does this all come from? Why was I so interested in rhetoric and writing techniques? It started because I had written my sort of autobiography of study skills. You know, how I learned study skills when I was undergraduate at Stanford, and then through medical school and through residency. And I have several friends who are lawyers, and I asked them to help me out as a favor and proofread my book. So when they were proofreading this book, they started making fun of me because I didn't use the correct punctuation here and there, or they're like, well, you're supposed to write out the number, or don't you think you could have phrased this more concisely? So they were making fun of me, and at first I thought, oh, are they, jerks? But then I realized they were right. They write all day long every day, so they had better writing than me. So what I did was I studied everything you could study about writing. This is one of the books I wrote called Rhyme, Rhetoric, and Logic. It's a big book. These are giant book. What is this, like 540 pages? I basically read everything you could read about how to write better, how to express yourself better. And I do a lot of teaching. I used to do even a lot more, in the conventional medical setting with lecturing. Back when I was a surgeon, they liked me lecturing, and I got invited to lecture a lot. But I was talking about conventional medical stuff. But still, I wanted to improve my public speaking ability and all that, and I was having fun with it. So anyways, that's where this book came from. And this guy, Kenneth Burke, is one of the people I studied in that process. I went through all the rhetoric of the ancient Greeks, the whole Socrates, Plato, Aristotle stuff. And then Kenneth Burke comes along as one of the more modern rhetoricians. And of course, Quintilian and Cicero and all that stuff. Okay, so Burke had felt that Aristotle had overemphasized logic. And I laughed that any married guy knows logic doesn't really go that far, okay? His books, like he wrote about, this guy Kenneth Burke, was called The Rhetoric of Motives, okay? Aristotle mostly focused on debating other men, other aristocratic men, who they had shared values, shared experiences. And to them, they felt that they could come to an absolute truth. Burke emphasized that a speaker must find common ground identification with the audience in order to be persuasive. Burke felt that it was more important for a speaker to figure out what was important to the audience than to just focus on their own logic and what they perceived as objective truth. The more a speaker has in common with the audience, the more likely the speaker will be able to persuade the audience. When one understands the motive of a speaker, one can better understand the implications of the speaker's statements and whether or not they are favorable. So here's Kenneth Burke. You can persuade a man only insofar as you can talk his language, by his speech, gesture, tonality, order, image, attitude, idea, and identifying your ways with his. Okay, a quote, complimentary quote from Cicero: rhetoric techniques are tools for winning debates. Kenneth Burke: rhetoric is more than good persuasion, it is good communication. Wherever there is persuasion, there is rhetoric. Rhetoric is basically a way to structure your sentences you're speaking to increase the impact, the persuadability of it. Kenneth Burke: stories are equipment for living. Okay. Kenneth Burke continues: we know as a matter of record that science under fascism became sinister. We are repeatedly admonished that there is a high percent of fascist motivation in our society. Why then should there not be correspondingly high incentive to sinister science? Okay, well, I don't know. Sometimes I throw quotes in because I was thinking of something else, even though that doesn't fit like sort of what we're talking about. Kenneth Burke: the real value in reading literature is that it provides students with imaginative rehearsals of the real world. Kenneth Burke: the more that I examine the structure of poetry and human relations, the more I am convinced that poetry is the basic figure of speech. Anything that rhymes sounds better, like Cicero had said. Rhyme is a magnet for the ear. Look at all these slogans. They routinely are persuasive and memorable because they rhyme. Okay, Aristotle: the essence of rhetoric is persuasion. It is easy to praise Athenians among Athenians. It is hard to praise Athenians among Spartans. Socrates, he sort of came later: rhetoric is the craftsmanship of persuasion. Quintilian: rhetoric is the art of speaking well. Quintilian ran a school of rhetoric in Rome, and he knew Cicero. Okay, Aristotle wrote The Art of Rhetoric in 330 BC. Cicero wrote De Oratore in 55 BC. Okay. Okay, one more quote from Aristotle. The mind speculates in pictures. If the mind sees an image as good, it pursues it. If the mind sees the image as bad, it avoids it. Yeah, so I write all about rhetoric. Everything you can want to know about rhetoric is in here. This book right here is just for quotes. So what I like about quotes is they're the fastest way to remember an author by their best quotes. Okay, now we're going to do just one more person. We're going to do Denis Burkitt, the great nutrition expert. So Denis Burkitt, he lived from 1911 to 1993. He was born in Ireland. He did some work as a surgeon in England, and then he went as a Christian missionary to Africa, where he spent many years, about 20 years. And he saw that, the typical diet in England was a high-fat diet, a Western diet, similar to the SAD diet, but they don't have all the modern processed foods back then. He became famous for describing something called Burkitt's lymphoma, let's say a lymphoma of the face. It could be in other locations, though, and trying to map out the pattern of disease causation. And there was some thought that it might be related to a virus, maybe Epstein-Barr or something like that. So anyways, that's how he became famous. And he did such a good job with that, they put him in charge of epidemiology for just about the whole continent. And so he saw lots of pattern diseases, and lots of people were reporting to him all the findings in their different hospitals. And he had some friends, Dr. Peter Cleve, Hugh Trowell, and Alec Walker. The biography of him is really good. It was written by a lady. I forget her name, Ethel or something. Dr. Cleve especially emphasized the role of simple sugars in causing Western diseases. Trowell, Walker, and Burkitt emphasized the lack of dietary fiber as the main problem with Western diets. Later, Nathan Pritikin would emphasize the excess fat in the Western diet as a major cause of disease. And also McDougall would also say the worst, biggest toxin, poison in the Western diet is the high fat content. Burkitt saw that Western diets created a whole new pattern of diseases that did not occur in persons eating traditional endemic plant-based diets. Burkitt concluded that fiber was the most important variable. Burkitt noted that meat-refined flour, typical of Western diets, had a slow intestinal transit time and small, hard stools. Burkitt traveled all over Africa on safaris over 10,000 miles. Yeah, he was famous for doing that. But one of the points to be made with this, of course, is that if you eat high-fibered foods, then you have to eat plant foods because only plants have fiber. There is no fiber in meat. There's very little in processed food. Okay, then he studied the data from all his places. Denis Burkitt said, in Uganda, coronary artery disease is almost non-existent. The Ugandans ate a plant-based diet with only 1 out of 636 deaths due to myocardial infarction. There was almost zero diverticulitis, appendicitis, constipation, diabetes, gallstones, kidney stones, hiatal hernia, varicose veins, or colon cancer. These are things you see all day long, every day in a Western hospital. I can tell you the majority of patients over 50 have diverticulosis. Westerners do not eat enough fiber. Westerners eat too much refined flour and sugar. The African populations he worked with, they ate mostly yams, which are basically sweet potatoes, and brown rice, and they had a much faster intestinal time. Burkitt noted that the Irish manual laborers were healthy on a diet of just potatoes and a pint of milk or beer or water. Burkitt also observed that vegetarian persons had bigger stools than non-vegetarians. Yeah, he was a meticulous guy. He would measure people's stool sizes, count the number of stools per day. He was very meticulous about that. So he got named Dr. Fiber, the big expert in the world. And he described abdominal pressure syndrome, meaning that the back pressure from straining at defecation when you're constipated due to a lack of fiber from eating a meat-based diet led to back pressure effects in the abdomen like diverticulosis, hiatal hernia, and whatnot. I got separate videos on abdominal pressure syndrome. Okay, fiber is only present in plant foods. Vegetarians had much less constipation, diverticulosis, appendicitis, hiatal hernia, gastroesophageal reflux, all that abdominal pressure syndrome stuff. Because the fiber pulls water into the stool, it softens it, so their stools are softer. Also, it's bulkier. It stretches the rectum, causing a reflex contraction. Your stool's not so bulky. It's all dried out because of the lack of fiber when you eat a meat and a processed food diet. So it doesn't stretch the rectum. You don't get that reflex contraction, and you have to strain your abdominal muscles. It's called the Valsalva effect to defecate when you eat that type of diet. Okay, less straining means less back pressure on the abdomen. Less back pressure means less diverticulosis, gastroesophageal reflux, all that stuff. Less hiatal hernia, less umbilical hernia, less inguinal hernia. So Burkitt recognized that the abdominal pressure syndrome from straining at defecation also caused hemorrhoids, spermatocele, varicocele veins in the legs, varicocele veins in the scrotum, varicose veins in the legs. They also got more fatty liver, more diabetes, all the high-fat diseases of the Western populations. And you notice they had worse teeth. Basically, we're made to eat plant-based diet, so everything's better with plant-based diet. Burkitt traveled a lot giving lectures then in the United States. That's where Dr. McDougall first met him in about 1972, and that McDougall said that changed his life. He was the first person who came along and explained how diet could be related to disease. Okay. What Burkitt also noticed is that people would remember his pictorial illustrations for years. Even many years later, they would often recall that picture. So he started to emphasize that, and I think that's true as well. Whenever possible, try to show a picture. The brain's made for memorizing pictures more than words. Let's see. His daughter Judy was able to draw stuff for him, and that helped him there. McDougall's quotes here: "It's better to build a fence at the top of a cliff than to park an ambulance at the bottom." That's what Western medicine does. Better to prevent disease. Prevention can eliminate disease, but early diagnosis and good treatment can only rarely eliminate disease. Our bodies are adapted to a Stone Age diet of roots and vegetables. If people pass small stools, you will need large hospitals. The only way to reduce disease is to go backward to the diets and lifestyles of our ancestors. Yeah, and he's absolutely right. I'll see there's like 20,000 patients that'll come in for colonoscopies, CAT scans, ultrasounds, MRIs, X-rays, you name it, for every one patient that wants to eat a low-fat vegan diet. And it's so obvious. I mean, it's like the best deal you're ever going to get for almost anything in your whole life. Why not just keep yourself healthy so you don't get all these diseases? Pretty easy to do. And once you get used to a low-fat vegan diet, you like it. I would never want to eat any other way. I mean, it's so easy, convenient, and it works. Okay, in 20 years with a vegetarian population, I only had to remove one gallstone. The citizens of countries that don't get bowel cancer, they don't get bowel polyps either. The thinking that doctors and hospitals are needed to keep a society healthy is just plain rubbish. So if you think about it, doctors can't help you very much with the chronic diseases because they don't know nutrition, epidemiology, toxicology. So these are the common things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, atherosclerosis, and related things. So the point is, if you just eat the healthy diet, you really don't need the medical system much. You really don't. For an acute problem, you might need it. But for chronic stuff, you just prevent it all. And that's a lot. So anyways, hope that was helpful.